Harlem, New York. The time read 4:37 inches the afternoon on a Tuesday, specifically February 4th, 1947. The air temperature lingered near 18 degrees, accompanied by winds sharp enough to slice through layers of fabric like blades. That's when Bumpy Johnson's black Cadillac made its turn onto Lenox Avenue, moving in the direction of his office situated above the Palm Café. The vehicle's driver found it necessary to reduce speed. An elderly colored woman occupied the center of the roadway. She wasn't in motion. She made no effort to clear the path. She simply stood in place, her arms clutching her own body for warmth against the bitter cold. Her clothing consisted of a lightweight house dress, woefully insufficient for the February climate, with no coat whatsoever covering her frame. Her gray hair remained uncombed. A recent bruise marked her left cheek, displaying purple discoloration and swelling. When Johnson's driver pressed the horn in an attempt to prompt her movement, she remained stationary, her gaze fixed directly on the rear window of the Cadillac, the location where Johnson sat. She lifted a single hand in a motion that carried no threat. Instead, the gesture conveyed pleading desperation. This was the posture of an individual stripped of all resources, making what appeared to be a final attempt at survival before surrendering completely. Johnson instructed his driver to halt the vehicle. William "Bub" Hewlett, serving as his bodyguard, responded with immediate tension. His hand shifted toward the .45 automatic weapon secured in his shoulder holster. Standing in the roadway to block Johnson's automobile represented precisely the method assassins might employ for setting up an ambush. Competitors had attempted to end Johnson's life twice before using similar tactics. Hewlett's professional responsibility involved treating every unexpected circumstance as potentially lethal. However, Johnson signaled Hewlett to stand down. He lowered the window and called out to the woman, "Ma'am, you're positioned in the middle of the street during freezing conditions, without any coat. What's the matter? Do you require assistance?" The woman approached the car with slow deliberation, her movement suggesting each step caused pain, as though her body was approaching failure. Upon reaching the window, Johnson observed that the facial bruise appeared fresh, perhaps no more than 24 hours old. She trembled with such intensity that her speech emerged broken and halting. "Mr. Johnson, sir, I'm aware of your identity. Everyone throughout Harlem knows your identity. I apologize for stopping your vehicle in this manner, but I found myself without alternatives. Food hasn't passed my lips in 3 days. My electrical service has been disconnected for a week's time. My heating has remained off for 10 days now. I'm residing in my apartment without power, without heat during this cold spell, and purchasing food exceeds my financial capability. I ventured outside because I held hope that perhaps if I could locate you, you might offer help. Just one loaf of bread, Mr. Johnson. That represents my entire need. Simply one loaf of bread so I can consume something. I'm begging you." Johnson studied this woman carefully. Her age appeared to be 70 years, potentially older. Her face displayed weathering from decades spent enduring poverty and hardship. The dress she wore had undergone washing so many times the fabric had become nearly threadbare. House slippers covered her feet rather than appropriate shoes. He experienced something unfamiliar, something that penetrated the protective indifference that 3 decades of criminal activity had constructed around his emotional capacity. This individual wasn't requesting assistance for gambling purposes. This wasn't someone seeking a handout driven by laziness. This wasn't someone attempting to manipulate an angle. This represented a Harlem grandmother literally experiencing freezing and starvation within her own residence. Her desperation had reached such levels that she'd intercepted a gangster's automobile in the middle of the street to request a single loaf of bread. "Ma'am, enter the car," Johnson stated, pushing the door open. "You'll freeze to death remaining out here." The woman displayed hesitation, obviously frightened at the prospect of entering a vehicle containing Bumpy Johnson and his bodyguard. Yet the cold overwhelmed her fear. She climbed into the warm interior space, immediately beginning to weep from the relief provided by escaping the wind. Johnson removed his own overcoat an expensive garment made of camel hair that had required a $300 expenditure, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "What name do you go by, ma'am?" he inquired with gentleness. "Elizabeth Carter," she responded through teeth that chattered. "My residence is at 347 West, 134th Street, apartment 4B. My age is 72 years. Harlem has been my home for 43 years, dating back to when I traveled up from Virginia in 1904. Employment as a domestic servant for white families downtown sustained me until advancing age prevented me from working 5 years prior. Currently, I exist on nothing. No pension exists, no savings exist, nothing exists. City welfare provides me with $11 monthly, but my rent costs $8, leaving me with $3 for all other necessities. Food, electricity, heat, everything. I had been making do, but this winter has delivered such severe cold. The electric company terminated my power due to my inability to make payment. Subsequently, the landlord shut off my heat, claiming I owe him overdue rent. I possess no money whatsoever. Food hasn't entered my body since Sunday. I simply needed one loaf of bread, just something for nourishment. I had heard you assist people on occasion, Mr. Johnson. Stories reached me about how you help people. My thinking was, perhaps if I could find you, you might provide me with just one loaf of bread." Johnson remained quiet momentarily, processing the information he was receiving. $3 monthly after covering rent. $3 to encompass food, electricity, heat, clothing, medicine, everything required for human survival. This woman had been managing on that amount. She'd been surviving somehow until this particular winter when the cold became unbearable and the unpaid bills accumulated. Now she was experiencing freezing and starvation in her apartment with no path forward. The reality of Elizabeth Carter's existence struck Johnson with force, not because naivety about poverty affected him. He'd witnessed poverty throughout his entire existence, had experienced it himself growing up in South Carolina, where his family frequently endured hunger. The impact came from sitting in his heated Cadillac, wearing a $300 overcoat, a $20,000 diamond ring adorning his finger, having just collected $15,000 in policy gambling profits that very morning. The stark contrast between his wealth and this woman's destitution became so pronounced that it compelled him to confront precisely what type of society generated both conditions simultaneously. Yet something else demanded attention, that facial bruise, fresh, recent, inflicted within approximately the last 24 hours. Johnson had accumulated enough experience with violence throughout his life to recognize what a bruise from being struck appeared like. That bruise marking Elizabeth Carter's face had originated from someone's hand, from someone striking her deliberately and with force. "Mrs. Carter," Johnson said with care, "that bruise marking your face. How did you acquire that?" Elizabeth directed her gaze downward, displaying embarrassment, displaying shame. "It's nothing of consequence, Mr. Johnson, simply an accident. I experienced a fall." "Mrs. Carter?" Johnson stated again, his voice maintaining gentleness, but carrying an underlying edge of steel. "I've spent enough time in this life to distinguish what accidents resemble and what being struck resembles. Someone hit you. Who committed this act?" Elizabeth resumed crying with greater intensity this time. The variety of crying that emerges from shame and humiliation, from containing pain for excessive duration. The account emerged in fragments between sobs. The type of confession people make when they've carried a terrible secret alone for such extended periods that the relief of finally revealing it to someone overwhelms their shame regarding the disclosure. "My son," she finally articulated, "my son Edward. His age is 43 years and alcoholism controls him. Drinking has occupied his life since age 17. Every employment position he ever secured was lost because of it. Maintaining a place to reside proves impossible for him. Most nights find him sleeping on the streets or in flop houses when money for a bed becomes available. He arrives at my apartment sometimes requesting money to purchase liquor. When I inform him I possess no money, Anger overtakes him. Meanness emerges. 2 days prior, he came knocking at my door at 3:00 the morning hours, intoxicated to the point he could barely maintain his stance, demanding money. I told him I possessed nothing to give him, that I was barely surviving myself, that I couldn't provide him money for drinking when I lacked money for food, and he struck me, knocked me to the floor. I fell against the kitchen table and injured my hip. Then he searched through my apartment until he discovered the single dollar I had concealed in a coffee can for absolute emergencies. He took it and departed. I haven't encountered him since that moment." Johnson's facial expression turned cold in a manner that caused Hulett to glance over from the front seat. He recognized the expression, signifying Johnson was about to commit something violent. Hulett had observed that expression previously. He'd seen it immediately before Johnson ended the life of a man who deceived elderly people through a housing fraud scheme. He'd witnessed it before Johnson administered a beating to a pimp so severe the man required 3 months of hospitalization after Johnson learned he was compelling 14-year-old girls into prostitution. That expression indicated someone had crossed a boundary that Johnson refused to tolerate, that someone was about to face consequences that would prove severe and immediate and completely without mercy. Yet Johnson's voice maintained calmness when he addressed Elizabeth. "Mrs. Carter, I require you to tell me about your son. Not about the drinking habit, not about what he did 2 days ago. Tell me about the person he was before alcohol destroyed him. Tell me about the man he used to be." Elizabeth wiped her eyes using the sleeve of Johnson's overcoat. She appeared confused by the question, but provided an answer regardless. Edward was a good boy, smart as well. He completed high school, one of the few colored boys in his class who accomplished that. Teaching represented his aspiration. He wanted to teach mathematics because numbers always came so naturally to him. But teaching positions for colored men didn't exist, not genuine ones anyway. So he accepted whatever work became available. The docks provided employment for a period, factories offered work, janitorial positions in office buildings downtown, but the work proved difficult and the compensation was terrible. The white men he worked alongside treated him as though he was stupid, even though his intelligence exceeded most of theirs. Somewhere during that journey, Edward began drinking. Initially, it represented just a small amount, just to reduce the edge after difficult days. But then it increased, and then it became constant. The job at the docks was lost because he appeared intoxicated. The factory position was lost because he engaged in a fight with a foreman who directed a racial slur toward him. Following that, nobody would provide him employment. He's existed on the streets for nearly 15 years currently, living like an animal, drinking away whatever money he can beg or steal. I've watched my boy, my intelligent, kind boy who aspired to be a teacher, transform into someone I no longer recognize. She paused, directing her gaze straight at Johnson. "But you want to know something, Mr. Johnson. I still observe glimpses of who he used to be. Sometimes when he arrives to visit and he's maintained sobriety for a few hours, I see the Edward eye raised. The boy who used to assist me carrying groceries up 4 flights of stairs. The young man who used to read to me from newspapers because my vision wasn't as strong as his. He's still in there somewhere, buried beneath the alcohol and the anger and the shame. But I don't know how to reach him anymore. I'm too old, too poor, too exhausted, and now he's causing me harm, and I don't know what actions to take about it." Johnson withdrew his wallet, removed 5 $20 bills totaling $100, and extended them to Elizabeth. She stared at the money as though it originated from another planet. More money than she'd seen in years. More money than her mind could process. "Mr. Johnson, I cannot accept this. I simply requested 1 loaf of bread. This exceeds what's appropriate." "Mrs. Carter, you accept that money," Johnson stated with firmness. "You proceed to pay your electric bill today. Immediately, as soon as we deliver you home, you pay your landlord what you owe him so he restores your heat. You purchase yourself a warm coat and appropriate shoes because you cannot proceed through the remainder of this winter in a house dress and slippers. You purchase groceries, genuine groceries, not just bread, but meat and vegetables and items that'll maintain your strength. You purchase whatever medicine you require for that hip you injured when Edward knocked you to the floor. And whatever remains after all that, you retain for emergencies. Do you understand? This doesn't represent charity, Mrs. Carter. Consider it payment for all those years you worked for white families downtown who probably compensated you with pennies and treated you terribly. Consider it payment that this city should have provided you decades ago but never did. You accept this money and you utilize it to survive because you deserve to survive. You've earned the right to live with dignity during your elderly years. Elizabeth grasped the money with trembling hands, tears streaming across her weathered face. God bless you, Mr. Johnson. God bless you. I don't know how to express my thanks. I don't know what I did to deserve this kindness. You didn't have to do anything to deserve it, Johnson said. You're a Harlem woman who labored your whole life. You're being left to freeze and starve because this country doesn't take care of its elderly population. That's not right. That's not fair. If I can help correct it, even just for a single person, then I'm going to help. He paused, his voice adopting a harder quality. But Mrs. Carter, you listen to me with great care now. You don't provide a single dollar of that money to your son if he arrives, not $1. That money is for you, to keep you alive, to keep you from freezing in your apartment. If Edward comes requesting money, you tell him no. You tell him his mother doesn't have anything to give him. Do you understand? Because if you give him that money, he'll drink it away in 2 days' time. Then you'll be right back where you were, freezing and starving. I can't keep providing you money every week. So you promise me that money stays with you and doesn't go to Edward. Elizabeth nodded with vigor. I promise, Mr. Johnson. I promise I won't give him any portion of it. I'll use it for myself. Exactly as you stated. Johnson instructed his driver to transport Elizabeth home to 347 West 134th Street, to wait while she went upstairs to secure the money in a safe location, then to transport her to the electric company office where she could settle her bill and get her power restored. Following that, take her wherever she needs to proceed, grocery store, clothing store, wherever. You make certain she gets home safely with everything she purchased. You make certain nobody bothers her. Do you understand? The driver acknowledged. I understand, Mr. Johnson. I'll handle it. Johnson turned back toward Elizabeth. Mrs. Carter, you proceed to do what you need to do. Get your power restored, get your heat restored, get yourself warm and fed. I'm going to handle the situation with your son. I'm going to have a conversation with Edward about what transpired 2 days ago. I'm going to make certain it doesn't happen again. Elizabeth's face displayed fear. Mr. Johnson, please don't harm him. I know what he did was wrong. I know he shouldn't have struck me, but he's sick. The drinking has made him sick. He's not a bad man. He's just a sick man. Johnson's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Carter, I'm not going to kill your son. I'm not going to put him in the hospital. But I am going to make very clear to him that striking his 72-year-old mother is unacceptable. That if it happens again, there will be consequences he won't survive. I'm going to do something else as well. I'm going to try to help him if he'll permit me to help him. But first, I need to locate him. Where does your son usually go when he's drinking? Where can I find him this time of day? Elizabeth hesitated, clearly experiencing conflict between wanting to protect her son and understanding that Johnson was going to find Edward regardless of whether she assisted. There's a location on 133rd Street between Lenox and 7th Avenue, she finally said quietly, an alley behind Cohen's liquor store where the drunks gather when they've acquired money to drink. Edward's usually there in the afternoons if he's managed to get money somehow. If he doesn't have money for liquor, he's down by the docks attempting to rob people coming off shift, or he's stealing items from stores to sell to the fence on 142nd Street, but the alley behind Cohen's is where he goes when he's got a bottle. So that's probably where he is currently. If he still has any portion of my dollar remaining? Johnson nodded. All right, you go take care of yourself, Mrs. Carter. Get warm, get fed. Don't worry about Edward. I'll handle it. He exited the Cadillac, then leaned back inside through the window. "And Mrs. Carter, if Edward comes around again demanding money or causing problems, you send someone to find me. You tell them to proceed to the Palm Café and tell whoever's there that Mrs. Elizabeth Carter on 134th Street needs Bumpy Johnson. Someone will find me and I'll come help. You don't have to be afraid of your son anymore. That's finished as of today." Elizabeth nodded, still crying, still clutching the $100 as though it might vanish if she released her grip. As the Cadillac pulled away, transporting her home, Johnson turned toward Hulett. "Bub, you and me are taking a walk to 133rd Street. We need to have a conversation with Mrs. Carter's son about respecting his mother." They walked the 6 blocks to Cohen's liquor store in silence. Johnson's face remained set in that cold expression that Hulett had learned over 2 decades indicated Johnson was beyond angry. He was in that state of controlled fury where violence was inevitable. The only question was how severe it would be. The alley behind Cohen's matched exactly what Elizabeth had described, a narrow passage between 2 buildings where sunlight barely penetrated, where garbage was accumulated in corners, where broken bottles covered the ground, where 4 men sat on cardboard boxes passing bottles wrapped in paper bags between them, all of them in various stages of intoxication ranging from pleasantly drunk to barely conscious. Edward Carter was the second man from the left, sitting with his back against the brick wall, a bottle of cheap whiskey clutched in his right hand, his clothes filthy and torn, his face unshaven for at least a week's duration, his hands shaking from alcohol withdrawal or from the cold, or both. He was in the middle of telling some story to the other drunks, something about a fight he'd supposedly won years ago, his words slurred, his gestures exaggerated, the way drunks' gestures become when they're trying to convince themselves that their lives hold meaning and that their stories matter. The other men saw Johnson and Hulett first. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson by sight. Hulett's massive frame and the bulge of the .45 under his jacket made it clear he wasn't someone to be trifled with. They immediately scrambled to their feet and backed away, understanding with the instinctive survival sense that chronic drunks develop that when Bumpy Johnson appeared with his enforcer, there was about to be trouble. They didn't want any part of it. Edward, too drunk to notice what was happening, kept talking, kept gesturing with his bottle, kept telling his story that nobody was listening to anymore, until Johnson's shadow fell across him and blocked what little sunlight reached into the alley. Edward looked upward, squinting against the sudden change in light, trying to focus on who was standing over him. His alcohol-fogged brain took several seconds to process what he was seeing, to recognize Bumpy Johnson's face, to understand that this was serious, that this was dangerous, that something very bad was about to happen. Edward tried to stand up, tried to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He only managed to knock over his bottle, spilling the remaining whiskey across the filthy ground. "Edward Carter?" Johnson asked, his voice quiet and deadly calm. "Yeah, that's me," Edward managed to say, his words slurred. Who's asking?" Johnson reached down, grabbed Edward by the front of his shirt, lifted him to his feet with one smooth motion that demonstrated strength that a 42-year-old man shouldn't possess. But that Johnson had maintained through decades of physical violence. Edward suddenly realized who was holding him, realized that Bumpy Johnson himself was here in this alley, was holding him, was looking at him with eyes that promised violence. Edward's alcohol-clouded mind cleared just enough to understand that this was about something serious, that he'd done something to attract the attention of Harlem's most dangerous man. "Your mother is 72 years old," Johnson said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the confined space of the alley. "She weighs maybe 90 pounds, soaking wet. She's living in an apartment with no electricity, no heat in the middle of February when it's 18 degrees outside. She's surviving on $3 a month after she pays rent. $3 to cover food, medicine, everything a person needs to live. She hasn't eaten in 3 days. She's wearing a thin house dress and slippers because she can't afford a coat or proper shoes. 2 days ago, you went to her apartment at 3:00 the morning, drunk off your rear end, demanding money. When she told you she didn't have any money to give you, you hit her. You hit your 72-year-old mother who was already starving and freezing. You knocked her down, hurt her hip, left a bruise on her face the size of my hand. Then you searched her apartment until you found the single dollar she'd been hiding for absolute emergencies. You stole it so you could buy the liquor you're drinking right now. Edward's face went pale underneath the grime. Fear cut through the alcohol fog like a knife. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Because what could he possibly say that would make any of this better? What excuse could he possibly offer for hitting his own mother and stealing from her when she had nothing? "I didn't mean to," Edward finally managed. I was drunk and I needed." Johnson's right hand came up so fast Edward didn't see it coming. The slap connected with Edward's face with a sound like a firecracker going off in the confined space of the alley, snapping Edward's head to the side, splitting his lip, sending blood running down his chin and neck. Edward cried out in pain and shock, tried to cover his face with his hands, but Johnson grabbed him again and pulled him close, so close their faces were inches apart. So close Edward could smell the expensive Cuban cigar on Johnson's breath, could see the absolutely cold fury in Johnson's eyes. "That's the last time you ever touch your mother," Johnson said. Each word clear and distinct and heavy with threat that wasn't implied but was promised. The absolute last time. You understand me? You don't ask her for money. You don't go to her apartment when you're drunk. You don't bother her. You don't upset her. You don't steal from her. You don't so much as raise your voice to her ever again. Because if I hear that you've touched her, if I hear that you've taken anything from her, if I hear that you've upset her in any way whatsoever, I will find you. Brother, I can find anyone in Harlem. I will hurt you in ways that will make you wish you'd never been born. I will break bones that you didn't know you had. I will make you feel pain that you can't imagine. Then after you heal, if you heal, I'll come back and do it again. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Edward? Do you understand that this is the only warning you're going to get?" Edward was crying now, blood and tears and mucus running down his face, his body shaking, not just from alcohol withdrawal, but from genuine terror, because he understood that Bumpy Johnson wasn't making empty threats, that Johnson had killed men for far less than what Edward had done, that the only reason Edward was still alive was because Johnson had decided for some reason to give him one chance to change. "I understand, Mr. Johnson," Edward sobbed. "I understand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did it. I was drunk and I wasn't thinking and I just needed money for a drink. I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear I didn't mean to hurt her." "Sorry doesn't mean anything," Johnson said, his grip on Edward's shirt not loosening. "Sorry is just words, just sounds that come out of your mouth when you want people to stop being mad at you. Sorry doesn't fix what you did. Sorry doesn't heal the bruise on your mother's face or give her back the dollar you stole or undo the fact that you knocked down a 72-year-old woman who'd been starving for 3 days. What matters isn't whether you're sorry now. What matters is what you do from this moment forward. What matters is whether you become a different person or whether you keep being the piece of garbage who hits his mother for liquor money." Johnson released Edward suddenly, let him stumble backward against the alley wall, let him wipe the blood from his mouth with a shaking hand that was so unsteady from alcohol withdrawal that he could barely perform the simple task. Edward just stood there crying, unable to respond, unable to defend himself because Johnson was right about everything, because Edward knew exactly what he'd become and hated himself for it, but couldn't stop, couldn't change, couldn't do anything except keep drinking until eventually he'd drink himself to death in some alley just like this one. "You're 43 years old," Johnson continued, his voice still quiet but now with something else underneath, something that might have been pity or might have been contempt or might have been both. "You're killing yourself with alcohol. You're living like an animal in alleys and flop houses. You're beating up your own mother for liquor money. That's pathetic. That's the life of a man who's already dead. He just hasn't laid down yet. You're what happens when a smart man gives up, when a man who could have been a teacher decides it's easier to drink than to fight, When someone who had potential decides that potential doesn't matter if the world isn't fair. Edward looked up at Johnson through blood and tears. What do you know about it? What do you know about being a colored man in this city? I finished high school, Mr. Johnson. I was good at mathematics. I could have been a teacher, but there weren't any teaching jobs for colored men. So I worked on the docks hauling cargo for white men who treated me like I was stupid. I worked in factories doing dangerous work for half what white men got paid. I worked as a janitor in office buildings, cleaning up after people who wouldn't shake my hand if I offered it. I did everything right, and it didn't matter because this country doesn't give a single care about colored men who try to better themselves. So, yeah, I started drinking because what's the point of being sober and watching your life go nowhere? What's the point of staying clean when you're never going to be anything anyway? Johnson stared at Edward for a long moment. You want to know what I know about being a colored man in this city? I grew up in South Carolina picking cotton for white men who thought they owned us even after slavery ended. My family went hungry so often, I can't remember all the times. We lived in a shack with no electricity, no running water, nothing but poverty and hunger and white people's contempt. I came to Harlem in 1919 with nothing, no education, no skills, no money. Nothing but a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. You know what I learned? I learned that this country is exactly as unfair as you say it is. I learned that colored men don't get the opportunities they deserve, don't get treated with respect, don't get a fair chance to succeed through legitimate work. I learned all of that, Edward. I learned it the same way you did. He took a step closer to Edward. But here's what else I learned. I learned that you can either accept that unfairness and let it destroy you, or you can find a way to survive anyway. You can either drink yourself to death in an alley feeling sorry for yourself, or you can figure out how to make a life despite the obstacles. I'm a criminal, Edward. I run policy gambling. I distribute narcotics. I hurt people when they threaten my business. I'm not a good man, and I'm not someone you should admire. But I'm also not a drunk who hits his mother. I'm not someone who gave up. I found a way to survive in an unfair world. Yeah, the way I found wasn't legal and wasn't moral, but it was a way. You could have found a way too if you'd kept fighting instead of giving up and climbing into a bottle. Edward slumped against the wall, Johnson's words hitting harder than the slap had. Because Johnson was right. Because Edward had given up. Had decided that drinking was easier than fighting. Had chosen the bottle over the struggle because the struggle seemed endless and pointless and the bottle provided temporary escape from having to care about any of it. But here's what's going to happen, Johnson continued, his voice taking on a different quality now, something that was almost gentle, something that suggested this wasn't just about punishment but about possibility. Tomorrow morning at 6:30, you're going to show up at Sam's restaurant on 135th Street and Lenox. You know where that is? Edward nodded weakly. He knew Sam's. Everyone in Harlem knew Sam's. It was a busy restaurant that served breakfast and lunch to working people. A legitimate business that had been operating for 20 years. Sam's a friend of mine, Johnson said. He owes me favors. More importantly, he's a good man who believes that people deserve second chances if they're willing to work for them. Sam needs someone to haul ice blocks from the delivery truck to the ice house in the back every morning. He needs someone to carry food supplies, sacks of flour, bags of rice, crates of vegetables from deliveries to the storage room. He needs someone to wash dishes, to mop floors, to take out garbage, to do all the physical labor that keeps a restaurant running. It's hard work. It's honest work. It pays $25 a week. Not much, but more than you're making now stealing and begging. You're going to show up at 6:30 tomorrow morning. You're going to tell Sam that Bumpy sent you. You're going to work every day, 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, 6:30 inches the morning to 3:30 inches the afternoon. You work hard. You keep your mouth shut. You don't cause problems. Every Friday, Sam will pay you $25 in cash. Edward stared at Johnson like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. A job. Real work. $25 a week. It had been years since anyone had offered him legitimate work. Years since anyone had looked at him as anything other than a worthless drunk who should be avoided or pitied. Why? Edward managed to ask through his tears and his split lip. "Why would you do this for me? I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I'm a drunk who hits his mother. Why would you give me a job?" "I'm not giving you a job," Johnson said flatly. "Sam's giving you a job, and he's doing it because I asked him to. Because he's the kind of man who believes people can change if they're given a reason to. You're not doing this for you. You're doing it for your mother. That woman spent 72 years surviving in a country that didn't want her to survive. She worked herself to exhaustion for white families who paid her pennies and treated her like she was invisible. She raised you by herself after your father left. Put food on the table when there wasn't enough food. Kept a roof over your head when there wasn't enough money for rent. She did all of that. Now she's living in poverty because this country doesn't give a single care about elderly colored women who've worked their whole lives. She deserves better than to be beaten by her alcoholic son. She deserves better than to starve while you drink. So you're going to give her better. You're going to show up tomorrow at 6:30. You're going to work hard. You're going to become the son she deserves instead of the man you've been." Johnson reached into his pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and held it out to Edward. "Here's $10. You go find a place that'll let you clean up. A bathhouse, a YMCA, somewhere. You wash yourself. You shave. You make yourself look like someone who's capable of working instead of looking like someone who sleeps in alleys. Then you find somewhere to sleep tonight that's not an alley. Get a bed in a flop house, somewhere warm where you can rest. Do not spend this money on alcohol. Do not stop at a liquor store. Do not buy a bottle. This is for cleaning up and for sleeping. Period. You show up tomorrow at Sam's looking clean and sober, and you get a chance to turn your life around. You show up drunk or you don't show up at all. I come looking for you. What happens next won't be a conversation. You understand the difference?" Edward took the $10 with shaking hands, stared at it like it was a lifeline being thrown to a drowning man, like it represented possibility that he'd thought was gone forever. "I'll be there," he said quietly. "I'll be clean and sober and ready to work. I promise." "Don't promise me," Johnson said. "Promise your mother. Promise the woman who's living in an apartment with no heat and no electricity because she gave everything she had to raise you. Promise her that you're going to be better. Then show up tomorrow and prove that your promise means something." Johnson turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at Edward one more time. "One more thing. Out of that $25 you'll be earning every week, you're going to give $10 to your mother. Every Friday, right after Sam pays you, you're going to walk to her apartment and you're going to give her $10 to help with her bills. That leaves you $15 a week for yourself. For food, for a place to sleep, for whatever you need. If you want to drink away that $15, that's your choice. I can't stop you from drinking, and I'm not going to try. But that $10 goes to your mother every week without fail. You miss one payment, you fail to show up one Friday with her money, we're going to have another conversation. That conversation won't end with you walking away. Do you understand?" "I understand," Edward said. $10 every Friday to my mother. I'll do it. I swear I'll do it." 6:30 tomorrow morning," Johnson said. "Sam's restaurant. Don't make me come looking for you." Edward Carter didn't sleep that night. He walked to the public bathhouse on 127th Street, paid 50 cents for hot water and soap, spent an hour scrubbing away weeks of dirt and grime, watching the water run black, then gray, and finally clear as he made himself clean for the first time in longer than he could remember. He found a barber shop that was still open at 8, 0 inches the evening, paid $1 for a shave, watched decades of beard fall away to reveal the face he used to have before alcohol had bloated and reddened it. He looked at himself in the barber's mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, still thin, still showing the damage that 15 years of drinking had inflicted. But human again, someone who looked like he might be capable of holding a job instead of looking like someone who'd given up entirely. He spent $3 on a bed in a flop house on 152nd Street, a tiny room with a thin mattress and a shared bathroom down the hall, but clean sheets and a lock on the door and heat that actually worked. He lay awake most of the night, his body screaming for alcohol, his hands shaking so badly he had to hold them together to keep them still, his mind racing with fear and hope and terror that he'd somehow fail this chance that Bumpy Johnson had given him, that he'd show up drunk or wouldn't show up at all, would prove that he was exactly the worthless drunk everyone believed he was. At 5:30 inches the morning, Edward gave up trying to sleep. He washed his face in the communal bathroom, put on the same clothes he'd been wearing, still dirty but the best he had, walked through pre-dawn Harlem streets toward Sam's restaurant. He arrived at 6:15, 15 minutes early, stood outside in the February cold, watching through the window as Sam and 2 other workers prepared for the breakfast rush. As they fired up the griddles and organized the kitchen and got ready for the day, at exactly 6:25, Edward took a deep breath and walked inside. Sam was a big Greek man, probably 60 years old, with gray hair and hands that looked like they'd spent decades doing hard physical work. He looked up when Edward entered, studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly like he'd been expecting him. "You, Edward Carter?" Sam asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Yes, sir," Edward said quietly. "Mr. Johnson told me to come see you about work." "Yeah, Bumpy called me last night," Sam said. "Told me you'd be coming. Told me you needed a job and that you'd work hard if somebody gave you a chance. Told me about your situation, about your mother, about everything. So let me tell you something, Edward. I don't care what you did before today. I don't care that you're a drunk, or that you lived on the streets, or that you hit your mother, or any of that. What happened before this moment doesn't matter to me. What matters is whether you show up on time, whether you do the work I need done, whether you cause problems, or whether you keep your head down and earn your pay. You show up every day, you work hard, you keep your mouth shut, you'll get paid every Friday. $25 cash, no taxes taken out. You don't show up, you come in drunk, you cause trouble with my other workers, you're gone. Bumpy will hear about it. You won't like what happens next. We clear on all that?" "We're clear, sir," Edward said, his voice stronger now. "I'll work hard. I'll show up every day. I won't cause problems. I promise." Sam studied Edward's face, saw something there that satisfied him. "All right then, come with me." The work was brutal. Sam took Edward out to the alley behind the restaurant where a truck was already waiting with the morning delivery. 6 massive blocks of ice, each weighing at least 100 pounds, that needed to be carried from the truck to the ice house where they'd keep the restaurant's food cold. Edward's body, weakened from years of alcohol and poor nutrition, screamed in protest as he lifted the first block. His back spasmed, his arms trembled, his legs nearly buckled under the weight. But he gritted his teeth and carried the ice block the 20 feet from the truck to the ice house, feeling like his spine might snap, like his legs might give out, like his body might simply refuse to do what he was demanding of it. But he did it. He carried all 6 ice blocks, one at a time, taking rest breaks between each one. His clothes soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature, his muscles burning, his breath coming in gasps. When the last block was in place, Edward leaned against the wall of the ice house, certain he was about to collapse, certain that his body couldn't possibly do another task. Sam appeared in the doorway. "Good. Now there's 50-pound sacks of flour and rice that need to be moved from the loading dock to the storage room, 20 sacks total. Then the breakfast dishes start coming in around 7, and they don't stop until 11. Then lunch dishes from 11:30 to 2. Then you mop the floors, take out the garbage, clean the bathrooms, help prep for tomorrow. Your shift ends at 3:30. Let's go." The first day was hell incarnate. Edward's body, which hadn't done meaningful physical labor in 15 years, rebelled at every task. His hands blistered from carrying the flour sacks, his back seized up from bending over the dish sink. His feet, unaccustomed to standing for 9 hours straight, developed blisters that made every step agony. By noon, he was seriously considering whether dying might be easier than continuing this work. By 2:00 the afternoon, he was crying while washing dishes. tears mixing with the scalding water and the sweat pouring off his face, his body telling him to quit, to give up, to go find a bottle and forget about all of this. But every time he thought about quitting, he remembered Bumpy Johnson's face inches from his, remembered the slap that had split his lip, remembered the threat of what would happen if he failed. More than that, he remembered his mother's face, remembered the bruise he'd put there, remembered her living in an apartment with no heat and no electricity while he drank away what little money he could steal. That shame, that guilt, that absolute rock-bottom recognition of what he'd become, that's what kept him going when his body wanted to quit. At 3:30 inches the afternoon, Sam came over to where Edward was mopping the floors. "That's your shift, Edward. You can go home." Edward leaned on the mop, barely able to stand. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Sam studied him for a moment. "You did good today. Work was hard. You complained some, but you didn't quit. That's what matters. You come back tomorrow, 6:30 inches the morning, do it again. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Edward said. "I'll be here." And he was. Edward showed up at 6:30 the next morning, his entire body aching, his hands covered in bandages where the blisters had been the day before, his feet so swollen he could barely get his shoes on. He showed up the day after that. And the day after that? Each day was agony. Each day his body screamed for alcohol, for the relief that a bottle would provide, for the escape from pain that drinking offered. But each day he resisted, not because he was strong, but because the fear of what Bumpy Johnson would do if he failed was stronger than the desire to drink. By the end of the first week, Edward's hands had developed calluses instead of blisters. His back still ached, but no longer spasmed with every movement. His arms no longer trembled when he lifted the ice blocks. His body was remembering how to work, was adapting to the demands being placed on it, was becoming functional again after years of abuse and neglect. Friday came. At 3:30 inches the afternoon, after Edward had finished his shift, Sam called him into the small office in the back of the restaurant. "You made it through your first week," Sam said, pulling an envelope from his desk drawer. "Showed up every day on time. Did the work without causing problems. That's what I need from my workers." He handed Edward the envelope. $25. Count it if you want." Edward's hands shook as he took the envelope. Not from alcohol withdrawal now, but from emotion. From the overwhelming feeling of having earned something honestly for the first time in years. He opened the envelope and stared at the bills inside. $5 bills. $25. More money than he'd held honestly in over a decade. Money that was his because he'd worked for it, because he'd earned it through sweat and pain and persistence. Because someone had paid him for doing something productive instead of money he'd begged or stolen or manipulated out of people. "Thank you, Mr. Sam," Edward said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me this chance." "Don't thank me," Sam said gruffly. "Thank Bumpy. He's the one who asked me to hire you. Remember what you're supposed to do with some of that money. You remember what Bumpy told you?" "Yes, sir," Edward said. $10 to my mother every Friday, I remember." Edward walked from Sam's restaurant to his mother's apartment at 347 West 134th Street, climbing the 4 flights of stairs slowly, because his legs ached and his feet hurt, because he was terrified of what he'd find when he knocked on her door. Would she be afraid of him? Would she refuse to see him? Would she call for help, thinking he was there to hurt her again? He knocked gently, heard movement inside the apartment, heard his mother's voice asking, "Who is it?" with fear in her tone. "It's Edward, Ma," he said through the door. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not drunk. I'm here to give you something. Please open the door." The door opened slowly, Elizabeth peering out through the gap, ready to slam it shut if Edward showed any sign of aggression or intoxication. But what she saw was her son. Clean, shaved, sober, looking more like the Edward she remembered from 20 years ago than the drunk who'd hit her 2 weeks earlier. "Ma," Edward said, his voice shaking. "I got a job. Mr. Johnson got me a job at Sam's restaurant. I worked all week. I just got paid." He pulled $10 from the envelope and held it out to her. "This is for you. To help with your bills, I'm going to give you $10 every Friday from now on. Every single Friday, as long as I'm working. I promise. Ma, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for hitting you, for stealing from you, for being the worst son any mother ever had. I can't take back what I did. But I can try to be better from now on. I can try to become the man you raised me to be instead of the drunk I became. So please, take this money. Let me start making things right." Elizabeth Carter stared at her son, saw that his eyes were clear for the first time in years, saw that his hands were steady, saw that he was telling the truth. She took the money with shaking hands. Then, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, she stepped forward and hugged her son. Really hugged him. The way a mother hugs a child she thought she'd lost, but who might somehow be finding his way back home. "Edward," she whispered, crying into his shoulder. "My boy, my Edward, you came back to me." They stood there in the doorway for a long time, mother and son both crying, both holding on to each other like they were afraid to let go, both understanding that this was fragile, that Edward's sobriety was new and could collapse at any moment, but also understanding that this moment was real, that for right now Edward was sober and working and trying to be better, that maybe, just maybe, the boy Elizabeth had raised was still in there somewhere, fighting to survive. Edward worked at Sam's restaurant for 11 years without missing a single day. Every Friday at 3:30 the afternoon, he'd collect his $25 from Sam. Every Friday at 4:00 the afternoon, he'd climb the stairs to apartment 4B at 347 West 134th Street and hand his mother $10. He stayed sober. Not because the desire to drink ever disappeared. It never did. Not really. But because the fear of disappointing his mother and the fear of facing Bumpy Johnson's wrath if he failed were stronger than the desire for alcohol. In 1952, Sam promoted Edward to assistant manager, increasing his pay to $40 a week. Edward still gave his mother $10 every Friday, but now he had $30 for himself, enough to rent a small apartment instead of sleeping in flop houses, enough to buy proper clothes, enough to start building something resembling a normal life. In 1955, Elizabeth Carter fell ill with pneumonia. By then she was 80 years old, her body worn out from decades of poverty and hard work. Edward visited her every evening after work, brought her soup from Sam's restaurant, sat with her while she slept, held her hand while she struggled to breathe. When she died on March 3rd, 1955, Edward had been sober for 8 years, had saved enough money to give her a proper funeral, had become the son she deserved instead of the drunk who'd hit her for money. At Elizabeth's funeral at Mount Olivet Baptist Church, Edward stood at the front with his mother's coffin, looking out at the small gathering of people who'd come to pay respects. Neighbors from her building, a few women she'd worked with decades earlier, the minister who'd known her for years. Standing in the very back of the church, almost invisible in the shadows, was Bumpy Johnson. After the service, as people filed out, Edward approached Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming. It would have meant a lot to my mother." Johnson nodded slightly. "She was a good woman, Edward. She survived things that would have killed most people. She deserved better than what life gave her." "She got better at the end," Edward said. "Because of you. Because you gave me that chance 8 years ago. Because you scared me straight and got me that job. I was able to take care of her these last years. She didn't die cold and hungry like she almost did before you helped us. She died warm in a clean apartment with her son, who loved her sitting beside her. That's because of what you did, Mr. Johnson. I can never repay you for that." Johnson was quiet for a moment. "You repaid me by showing up every day at Sam's, by staying sober, by giving your mother that $10 every Friday for 8 years, by becoming the man she raised you to be instead of staying the drunk who hit her. That's payment enough, Edward. You took the chance I gave you, and you didn't waste it. Most people waste their chances. You didn't. That matters. Edward Carter worked at Sam's restaurant until 1958, when he'd saved enough money to buy a small grocery store on 138th Street. He ran that grocery store for another 15 years, never drank again, never raised his hand to anyone, lived a quiet, decent life that would have been impossible without the intervention of a gangster who decided that even drunks who hit their mothers deserved one chance at redemption if they were willing to work for it. Every year, on February 4th, the anniversary of the day his mother had stopped Bumpy Johnson's car in the street to beg for one loaf of bread, Edward Carter walked to the Palm Café on 125th Street and left an envelope at the bar. Inside was always a note that said simply, "Thank you for giving me my life back," and $50 in cash, about all that Edward could afford, but which he gave anyway, because some debts can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged with whatever gratitude and generosity the debtor can manage.